It's Joel Sanchez here with you today from Crucified Life Ministries, and we're looking at the Torah portion, Vayetze, which can be found in Genesis chapter 28, verse 10, going through to chapter 32, verse 2. So let's begin I want to read some scriptures to get to the point that I want to make in this video. In this portion is the portion where we see Jacob leaving his father and mother's home and going to his uncle Laban's house. And here is where we see him having to work for Rachel. Not only just working for Rachel, but he actually ends up marrying Leah and Rachel. So that's basically what we're going to focus on in this week's video. So let's get started here. And I believe this is in chapter 29 of Genesis, let me see if I can run that down for you real quick here. Let's see here. I didn't write down the scripture, but Genesis 29 verse verse 13, beginning in verse 13 and going through to let's see, verse 30. Yeah. So verses in chapter 29, verses 13 through 30. And it reads, "When Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his house." That's very important. Okay? Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him something else very important. He said, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful and lovely. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife that I may go in to her, for my time is completed." So Laban, listen to this, another thing very important. So Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Here's a covenant. Okay, this is covenantal language. He made a feast, but in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to wife. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. So here we see in some of the verses that we read, Laban tells Jacob, "You are of my bone and you are of my flesh." And when Laban was telling this to Jacob, this is terms that are used in the ancient Near East to actually mean that Laban was legally adopting Jacob into his household as a son. Now, why would he adopt Jacob into his household as a son? Well, you also have to realize that it talks about in Genesis chapter 29 verse 9, it talks about Rachel. Remember when Jacob comes up, he sees Rachel with the sheep and everything. She's tending to her father's flock. But Genesis 29:9 says, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now this is interesting because usually in the ancient Near East, or during this time period, the women or the daughters did not, they weren't shepherds or shepherdesses, because this job would fall onto the sons or a boy or boys in the family. So what we can deduct from this is that Laban did not have any sons at this particular time. Although later on in this week's portion, you'll read that he does eventually have sons, because they were complaining because Jacob had become so wealthy. They said, you know, he's taking away our inheritance, he's taking away our father's goods. But at this time, what we can deduct from this, the reason why Rachel was a shepherdess was because Laban did not have any sons. So therefore, it gives more meaning to Laban telling Jacob, you're of my bone and you're of my flesh, come into my house. So therefore, when he did this, this was language of Laban taking or adopting, legally adopting Jacob into his household as an adopted son. Now, also we can get more evidence of this with Moshe or Moses. Remember, his father-in-law was Jethro, and Moses married Zipporah. And in Exodus chapter 2, verses 16 through 21, we're not going to read it all, but you can see that Jethro had, I believe it was 7 daughters. Yes, he had 7 daughters, and they came out to water their father's flocks. So in other words, they were shepherdesses as well, because Jethro didn't have any sons at this time. And so therefore, Jethro, when Moshe, some of the other shepherds, the men that were there, were bothering these girls. And so when this happened, Moshe basically watered all of these girls' flocks, and he kind of protected them. And so when they went back home, they told Jethro what had happened, what Moshe did for them. And he said, why didn't you invite this man to our home? So we see later on that they go back and they invite him in, and Jethro gives his daughter Zipporah to Moshe. So basically, he was as if he was adopting Moshe into his family, because in the ancient Near East, when men did not have a son, they didn't have someone to pass down their inheritance to. So therefore, they were always, or it was very important that they have a son, whether it be a biological son or an adopted son, so that they would be able to give their inheritance to them, and their lineage would be able to continue. And plus, when the father would become old and couldn't take care of himself, there would be a son there who had plenty of inheritance, who would be able to care for the father. So let's get back to this story. So we see Laban, he didn't have any sons to at this time to take care of his inheritance or to be able to take care of his daughters. So he brings Jacob into his home as an a legally adopted son. And he promises Jacob, he promises him Rachel. Now, we see also in the story that in the beginning, Laban loved Jacob. He loved Jacob, and, he embraced him. He brought him into his house. He even adopted him legally as a son. But later on in the story, we see almost Laban basically despised him. He no longer really cared for him because he deceived him not once but multiple times. He changed Jacob's wages, and he did deceitful things to Jacob. But part of the reason why that he despises him and does wrong to Jacob is because later on, like I mentioned before, we see that Laban ends up having biological sons. So therefore, he no longer needs Jacob to carry on his line. He actually has sons now, biological sons, who are able to carry on that biological line. So how does Laban, because this was like a contract it was a legally binding thing that Laban did with Jacob. So how does Laban legally, how is he able to get out of this contract without Jacob being able to sue him or bringing a lawsuit against him? Well, that's where the deception actually comes in at. And you have to go and you have to study the ancient Near East, and you have to look at in particular these things called the Nusi tablets. And in these tablets, they were actually found in the Mitanni area, the nation of Mitanni, which was in the ancient Near East. It was in like the Mesopotamia area, northern Iraq, part of Syria, that area there. And so in these Nusi tablets were actually many laws that they were able to translate and to study. But there was a couple in particular that was listed in there that dealt with this, and this was what Laban used at the time. These types of laws, or these clauses that we're going to look at, this is what Laban used to legally get out of Jacob being no longer, or Jacob forfeiting his inheritance. Okay? So, how did Jacob nullify his inheritance that he received through the adoption of Laban? Well, I've already mentioned one. When Laban had biological sons, it wasn't that really he forfeited his inheritance, but the inheritance went from Jacob, or like the double portion blessing or inheritance, it went to the firstborn. Even though Jacob would have still received a blessing in some part of the inheritance because he was legally adopted, he just wouldn't receive the double portion inheritance. But the next clause is the kicker. It's the one that caused Jacob to forfeit his inheritance completely, because when the clause states that if a man, the adopted son, would take another wife or multiple wives, then that forfeited the inheritance or his rights to the inheritance. So in other words, Laban was very astute. When Jacob worked for Rachel and he wanted to marry Rachel, Laban knew that legally he could get out of this after having not only just having his biological sons, but he could get out of not having to give Jacob any of the inheritance by tricking him, deceiving him into taking Leah, because he knew he loved Rachel and would work for Rachel and still wanted to be with Rachel and marry her. But by Jacob taking Leah, then he forfeited his right to any inheritance of Laban. So basically, like I mentioned, Laban legally deceives Jacob to get out of this binding contract, this adoption that he made with him as adopting him as his son. And what made it legal was when you see when Laban gives Jacob Leah and they have the wedding, you see a feast, a meal. A feast was given and they ate. This in the ancient Near East, anytime you made a meal with someone and you sat down to feast or eat together, this is a covenant. You were forming a covenant. So this marriage was binding, and especially after Leah goes in and Jacob ends up consummating intimately the marriage with Leah, then the deal is sealed. And Jacob can argue, he can do whatever he wants to do, but it's a done deal. And it's pretty much over with, and there's nothing else that Jacob can do because he took another wife. So therefore he forfeited his inheritance. Now, this truly was an injustice on the part of Laban. Laban was not being a just person, and he was not doing an act of justice nor righteousness. He actually knew what he was doing. It can even be said that Laban was a crook. He was a thief. He used deception to kind of squander or make Jacob work for him, and he basically was kind of getting wealthy off of the hard work and off of the back of Jacob. But even though this was an injustice, and I'm in full agreement, I'm not a big fan of Laban, we need to actually go back and remember something from last week's Torah portion. And this is the point I want to hit home in all of that. That even though Jacob had an injustice done to him, we must remember that just in last week's portion, we read about an injustice that Jacob actually did. When Esau comes in from the field and he's hungry, Jacob uses, instead of doing an act of justice and righteousness, Jacob uses this to his benefit, okay, to actually gain the blessing, the birthright from Esau, who is the firstborn. So then right after that, after he gains the birthright, Jacob inclines his ear to his mother. He listens to his mother. He dresses himself up as if he were Esau, goes into his father, who was pretty much blind or had lost most of his vision by this time, and Jacob deceitfully, or he deceives Isaac into thinking that he is Esau in order so that Isaac would bless him and give him the blessing of the firstborn. So this is actually why I believe that we see Laban, the events in the life of Jacob while he's at Laban's house. I believe this is why Jacob ended up getting deceived, or deception played into this story as well. Because Galatians chapter 6 verse 7 says something very interesting. It says, "Be not deceived. Yahweh is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Okay? So when Jacob inclines his ear to his mother's voice, and he goes in and deceives his father into thinking that he is Esau instead of being Jacob, then he used deception to gain something. Okay? And this law of sowing and reaping, it's a principle. And it doesn't matter if you're a believer or not a believer. It doesn't matter. Clearly, what you sow is what you reap. How you treat others is how, in return, you're going to be treated. So if we reap what we sow, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be sympathetic towards Jacob, because Laban really did take advantage of him. But at the same time, we must also kind of keep at the forefront of our minds that this is, I don't want to really say this is what Jacob deserved, but again, he reaped what he actually sowed. So in other words, one way or the other, Jacob ended up having to pay the piper. He ended up having to reap what he sowed. He sowed deception in order to get the blessing, the firstborn birthright. And what's funny is, when he ran away, he actually forfeited. In the ancient Near East, if you were the firstborn or you were a son and you ran away from home, you forfeited your rights and your inheritance and the portions that you were to receive. So this is why when he showed up at Laban's house, he didn't have anything. He didn't have material things or money to be able to purchase Rachel or to give a dowry for Rachel. Thus, he had to submit himself to Laban and work for her. So even though Jacob used deception to get the birthright and the blessing, he never actually received the inheritance from his father. So what we can actually take away from this story is that even though deception was used by a patriarch, we see how Yahweh redeems this situation and teaches a lesson not only to Jacob, but actually to you and I through this story of Jacob. He uses the bad things that we do to actually teach us a lesson. And if we allow him to work on and in us, he makes us more like him. And this is the important thing. Because a lot of times we look at the patriarchs as these, superhuman, superheroes. And I always say, they're men and women with weaknesses just like you and I. But in the end, their heart is to serve Yahweh and eventually do what's right. And therefore, through all of their flaws, through all of their errors, through all of their mistakes, you and I can be encouraged, because we can not only just read it as a historical story, but we can actually not fall into some of the same traps that the patriarchs had fallen into. So the Creator uses bad things to teach us a lesson. So before we actually act in a way that isn't scriptural by treating someone in a bad way or wanting to do something bad to someone, remember Galatians 6, that whatsoever a man soweth, he reapeth. So the same way that we treat others is the same way that we're going to in return be treated. And we may not have to give an account for this in 5 minutes when we do something wrong, or for a mistake that we make, or something that we sow. We may not be called on the carpet in 5 minutes or 5 months or even 5 years. But eventually, we're going to have to pay the piper. Eventually, we're going to have to give an account and have to deal with what we have sown, because it's like a seed. You put a seed in the ground, and the next day it doesn't have fruit on it, and it's not ripe, and you're not harvesting. It goes through a process, and that seed has to get to the point to where it produces the fruit. So therefore, when we sow something, many times we don't have to deal with what we've sown until later on in our lives. But the point of this, or the moral to the story, is that whatever we sow, one day eventually we're going to reap it, and we're going to be called on the carpet about it. So we better be careful. We better guard our words, and we better guard our actions. And we better not be unjust or do injustice to others that live around us or to our friends and family members. Because we're going to have to give an account to those things one day. So what we as believers should be doing is we should be sowing life, not only just into our own lives, but into the lives of those that are around us. And if we sow life into their lives, scripturally, we have a promise, we have a principle in Scripture that tells us whatever we sow, we will reap. So if we sow life, we're going to receive life. If we sow justice and righteousness, we're going to receive justice and righteousness. If we sow mercy and grace, we're going to receive mercy and grace. Shalom. Until next time, blessings. I'm Joel Sanchez with Crucified Life Ministries.